Sebastio stepped out of the Uber in front of the Grand Palace Hotel in New York City, wearing a hat and carrying a worn leather suitcase. He had on a checkered shirt, jeans, and simple boots. The staff didn't even move. At the front desk, the manager, Mauricio, looked him up and down with disdain. "Our rooms are far too expensive for someone like you," he said with arrogance. Then came the cruel challenge. If Sebastio could pay for the cheapest room, he would give him the suite. The humiliation was public and brutal. What Mauricio didn't know was that he had just challenged the wrong man. Because in a matter of minutes, the truth about who this simple-looking man really was would shake the entire hotel. The contrast was striking. While other guests arrived in Mercedes, BMWs, and Audis, dressed in Italian suits and pulling designer luggage, Sebastio walked in with his old leather bag and a calm smile. His steps were firm and steady, the kind of walk that came from someone who knew exactly where he stood in the world. Carla, the youngest receptionist, exchanged a discreet glance with a colleague who pretended to be busy with important papers. That was when Mauricio, the manager, came out of his office. He was 42 with slicked back hair, a flawless gray suit, and an arrogance that could be felt across the lobby. With 15 years working in luxury hotels, Mauricio prided himself on knowing exactly who belonged in that environment and who didn't. His eyes scanned Sebastio from head to toe like a machine calculating value and origin. "Good afternoon," Sebastio said politely, tipping his hat. "I'd like a room for 3 nights. Mauricio's smile never reached his eyes. It was the kind of smile Sebastio knew well, one he had seen in banks, expensive stores, and fine restaurants. The smile of someone who had already judged and condemned. "Of course, sir," Mauricio said, pausing dramatically. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I came straight from upstate. I thought I could get a room today." Other guests began paying attention. An elegant woman whispered something to her husband. A businessman in a navy suit stopped scrolling on his phone. The lobby, which had been filled with its usual background noise, now focused on this encounter. Mauricio typed into the computer with theatrically slow fingers, each keystroke like a hammer building a wall of humiliation. "Our rooms are a bit specific," he said with a sneer. "We only have suites available, $2,800 per night." He pronounced the amount like a final verdict, expecting Sebastio to retreat in shame. A few employees hovered nearby, curious to see how the embarrassment would unfold. But Sebastio simply nodded, as if the price were perfectly reasonable. "That's fine. Book it for 3 nights." The shock on Mauricio's face lasted only a second before being replaced by an even more cynical smile. Leaning over the counter, he asserted dominance. "You understand we need guarantees, right? Credit card, proof of income." His voice was loud enough for others to hear. "Our guests are usually people of a certain standard." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Conversations stopped. A heavy silence spread through the lobby. With an audience now watching, Mauricio pushed further. "You know what, my friend?" he said, smiling cruelly. "If you can afford the cheapest room, I'll give you the suite." The impact was immediate. A woman with an expensive handbag gasped. 2 businessmen exchanged uneasy looks. A young couple near the elevator froze to watch the public humiliation. Even the employees looked uncomfortable, though none dared intervene. Mauricio had crossed a dangerous line, turning quiet prejudice into open insult. Expecting laughter or subtle approval from the guests, he was met instead with disapproving expressions and a suffocating tension. Sebastio didn't lose his composure. His eyes, which had seen much in life, met Mauricio's with a calmness that only infuriated the manager more. There was no anger in that gaze, only a deep tranquility of someone who knew his own worth. "What's the price of the cheapest room?" he asked steadily, without the slightest hint of humiliation. Mauricio gave a low laugh, an unpleasant sound that echoed across the lobby. $800, he said, certain that this would end the charade once and for all. What Mauricio didn't realize was that he was about to face the greatest humiliation of his career. What he couldn't imagine was that the man in front of him had more money than most of the very guests he admired. What he couldn't predict was that his mocking bet would become the most expensive mistake of his professional life. Sebastio reached into the back pocket of his jeans, a simple gesture that would make the Grand Palace Hotel tremble within minutes. Justice sometimes arrives dressed in the simplest of ways. Mauricio felt at the height of his power. There he was, manager of one of the most prestigious hotels in New York City, putting an intruder in his place before an audience of distinguished guests. $800, he repeated, savoring every syllable. Up front, of course. Our hotel doesn't do installments. The word installments was spoken with such disdain that it seemed to stain the refined air of the lobby. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A blonde executive waiting on the sofa exchanged a significant glance with her colleague, as if to say, "What an embarrassing scene!" Sebastio stood motionless, hat in hand, staring directly into Mauricio's eyes. There was no defiance in that gaze, no submission either, only a deep tranquility that began to unsettle the manager. "All right," Sebastio said simply. "I accept the bet." Mauricio blinked twice, as if he hadn't heard correctly. He had expected pleading, excuses, maybe a shameful retreat. Anything but this disarming calm. "You accept." Mauricio's voice rose half a tone, betraying the first crack in his confidence. "I do. If I can pay the $800 up front, you'll give me the suite for free. That's what you said, isn't it?" The reception was now in complete silence. Even the employees had stopped working to listen. The situation had slipped out of Mauricio's control, but with so many eyes on him, he couldn't back down. "Perfect," he said, forcing a confident smile. "But when you can't pay, you'll have to leave immediately. And please use the back exit. We don't want any more embarrassment." The unnecessary cruelty of that last remark made some guests exchange reproachful looks. A man in his 60s murmured to his wife, "What bad manners!" But Mauricio, blinded by arrogance, couldn't see he was losing the sympathy of his own clientele. Sebastio nodded calmly and walked toward the nearest sofa, where he placed his leather suitcase. The movement caused a ripple across the lobby. Every eye followed him as if watching a Western duel. "What are you doing?" Mauricio demanded, his voice pitched higher with nervousness. "I'll sit for a bit," Sebastio replied, settling into the sofa as if it were his own living room. "I need to organize some documents." The idea that this simple-looking man might actually have $800 in cash planted a tiny seed of doubt in Mauricio's mind, though he quickly brushed it aside. Impossible, no one arriving by Uber dressed like that could possibly have so much money. Meanwhile, Sebastio calmly opened his suitcase. The sound of the zipper echoed through the silent lobby like a drum announcing battle. Inside, neatly arranged with military precision, were documents, a few sets of plain clothes, an old leather case, and a brown envelope. Mauricio watched, trying to keep a confident expression, but his eyes betrayed curiosity and a flicker of unease. What on earth was in that envelope? Sebastio pulled it out with the same steady composure and began counting what was inside. His hands moved with precision, stacking small piles onto the coffee table. "My God," whispered a nearby woman to her husband. "He's counting money." The news spread through the lobby like wildfire. Heads turned, conversations stopped, smartphones were discreetly aimed at the scene as Sebastio methodically organized the bills. Mauricio felt a tightening in his chest, his palms sweating with invisible gloves of anxiety, but he raised his voice to reassert authority. "Cash isn't enough. You'll need documents too, ID, proof of income." Sebastio looked up from the envelope and smiled for the first time since arriving. It was a gentle smile, almost paternal, that made Mauricio feel inexplicably small. "Don't worry, young man. I have everything here." The word young, spoken with such calm warmth, completely derailed the script Mauricio had written in his mind. How could this man maintain such dignity in the face of humiliation? Why wasn't he ashamed, nervous, defeated? Then Sebastio rose and walked back to the desk, holding a neat bundle of bills and a worn leather wallet. His footsteps echoed like tolling bells announcing something monumental. $800, he said, placing the money on the counter with the ease of ordering a coffee. Counted to the last dollar. The fingers, they read. Sebastião Mendonça da Silva, 54 years old. Everything seemed ordinary, exactly what one would expect from a country bumpkin out of place. But the cash spread on the counter told a different story. The receptionist Carla discreetly approached, curious to see the documents, while other employees positioned themselves strategically to watch what had started as routine humiliation turned into something completely unexpected. Where did this money come from? Mauricio asked, trying to regain control, his question cutting through the air like a gunshot. Guests turned fully toward the scene. An executive stopped scrolling through emails. A pair of business partners broke off mid-conversation. Even the cleaning staff abandoned their tasks to watch. Sebastião smiled again. That same paternal smile that disarmed Mauricio. It's honest money, young man, earned with the sweat of my work. What kind of work? Mauricio pressed, desperate to find something irregular to disqualify the payment. I'm a farmer, Sebastião answered simply. The reply drew muffled chuckles from a few guests, and Mauricio felt a wave of relief. Of course, just some small rancher who sold off cattle and now thought he belonged in a luxury hotel. A farmer, Mauricio repeated, regaining some arrogance. And what is a farmer doing in a place like this? His scorn made some guests shift uncomfortably. A man in a navy suit whispered to his wife about the manager's lack of manners. But Mauricio was too determined to notice. I came for the auction, Sebastião said calmly. What auction? The elite livestock auction tomorrow at the convention center. Mauricio frowned, imagining it as some rural sideshow, nothing worthy of serious wealth. And how much are you planning to spend at this auction? He asked with dripping irony. Depends on the animals available, Sebastião replied. But I brought enough for some good breeders. And how much does one of these breeders cost? Sebastião paused, calculating. It varies, from hundreds of thousands up to millions, depending on the lineage. The revelation hit the lobby like a small bomb. Conversations hushed, phones were lowered, and eyes turned back to Sebastião with renewed focus. Mauricio laughed loudly, a forced, nervous sound. Excuse me, are you telling me a bull costs millions of dollars? Yes, Sebastião replied evenly. The best ones can reach those prices, and if the bidding is right, I'll buy several. Mauricio shook his head as if dealing with a lunatic. My friend, you arrived here in an Uber, dressed like that. He gestured dismissively at Sebastião's simple clothes. And you expect me to believe you're about to spend a fortune on cattle? The lobby was frozen in suspense, like watching a car crash in slow motion. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Sebastião replied, his voice calm but firmer now. I only want the room you promised. Mauricio leaned across the desk, adopting an intimidating stance. Listen here, farmer. This is a serious hotel for serious people with serious money, not fairy tales about million-dollar cows. Several guests stirred uncomfortably, an elderly woman whispering to her husband that the manager was being extremely rude. Still, Mauricio dug deeper into his arrogance. The money is right there, Sebastião pointed at the bills. You made a bet. A man of his word honors it. Mauricio laughed cruelly. A man of his word doesn't invent fantasies about million-dollar livestock just to feel important. Then Sebastião did something no one expected. He went back to his suitcase, rummaged briefly, and returned with a worn-out smartphone. May I make a call? He asked politely. To whom? Mauricio demanded. My accountant. He can clarify some things. Mauricio hesitated, but with the entire lobby watching, retreat was impossible. Fine call. But when this little story falls apart, you're out immediately. Sebastião nodded and dialed, putting the call on speaker. A professional male voice answered, Good afternoon, Sebastião. How's the event in the city? Good afternoon, Dr. Robert. I'm well, thank you. May I ask you something about our preparations for tomorrow? Of course. We have a considerable reserve set aside for bidding, just as you requested, to give you comfortable margin for important acquisitions. The respectful, businesslike tone echoed across the silent lobby, making the ground seem to shift under Mauricio's feet. Perfect, Sebastio said. And payments? Same as always, bank transfer or the corporate card for smaller needs. Exactly, the accountant confirmed. Thank you, Dr. Robert. Sebastio hung up and slipped the phone into his pocket. The lobby was still as death, all eyes on him as if witnessing something extraordinary. Mauricio had gone pale, his hands visibly trembling as he tried to process what he'd just heard. A considerable reserve, a corporate card. The reality hammered at his arrogance. That doesn't prove anything, he stammered desperately. Anyone can ask a friend to pretend to be an accountant. The accusation was so pathetic it drew murmurs of disapproval from the guests. An executive shook her head in open reproach. A businessman muttered to his wife, "What a disgrace." Sebastio smiled again, this time with a trace of amusement. "You're right," he said. "Words are just words. How about something more concrete?" He returned to his suitcase, withdrew a black leather folder, pulled out carefully folded papers, and laid them on the counter. Last week's bank statement. Mauricio snatched the documents with trembling hands, scanning the numbers once, twice, 3 times. The checking account balance burned his eyes. A 7-figure sum beginning with a 3. And it wasn't just that. The history showed transfers in the hundreds of thousands, supplier payments, agricultural equipment purchases more expensive than luxury cars. This must be fake, Mauricio whispered, but his voice had lost all conviction. He knew he was clinging to increasingly fragile arguments. "You can call the bank and confirm," Sebastio offered. "I have my manager's card right here." The offer was made with such calm assurance that Mauricio's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He looked around the lobby and realized he had become the center of a humiliating spectacle. Guests were watching him with a mix of discomfort and disapproval. At that moment, an elegant couple entered the hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He in a flawless Italian suit, she in a gown that screamed fortune. The man walked directly to the front desk but stopped abruptly upon sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Mauricio and Sebastio. Mauricio saw an opportunity to salvage his image. "Just a little misunderstanding, Dr. Henry," he said, forcing a professional smile. "Nothing that compromises our services." Dr. Henry turned toward Sebastio, and his face lit up with recognition. Sebastio Mendonça. Sebastio looked genuinely surprised, breaking into a warm smile. "Dr. Henry, what a surprise to see you here." The two men embraced like old friends, clapping each other on the back. Mauricio's stomach dropped. "How's business?" asked Dr. Henry. "I heard you made some big acquisitions at the Sao Paulo auction." "Picked up a few interesting bulls," Sebastio replied modestly. "Their genetics will make a real difference in my herd." Mauricio felt the ground collapse under him. One of the hotel's most prestigious clients not only knew but deeply respected the man Mauricio had been publicly humiliating for the past 20 minutes. "And you? Still breeding those Arabian horses?" Sebastio asked. "Always," Dr. Henry grinned. "In fact, I've got a colt you might like, son of one of my best studs. Remember Al-Rashid?" The casual exchange, names, bloodlines, fortunes implied, cut into Mauricio like knives. Finally, Dr. Henry turned to him, his expression hardening at the obvious shame on the manager's face. "Mauricio, I trust you're treating my friend with the respect he deserves?" The authority in his voice made Mauricio swallow hard. Of course, he stammered. "We were just sorting out some details about his stay." "What details?" Dr. Henry pressed, clearly suspicious. Sebastio stepped in calmly. "This young man here made a bet with me. If I could pay $800 in cash for the simplest room, he'd give me the presidential suite for free." Dr. Henry's eyes widened, then narrowed with disdain. "You made a bet with Sebastio Mendonça?" The way he spoke the name with weight and reverence made Mauricio realize just how grave his mistake had been. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" "That you were dealing with one of the most respected cattlemen in the hemisphere." Dr. Henry's words landed like hammers, destroying the last pieces of Mauricio's dignity. The entire lobby watched his downfall with addressed the entire room. It revolutionized cattle genetics and is studied at international universities. Conversations halted, phones lowered, and a corporate executive gasped softly after checking her phone. My God, it's true. It's right here in the search results. Mauricio felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. This man he mocked was a global authority. Please, Henry, Sebastio protested modestly. That's enough. No, it's not enough, Henry shot back. This hotel must understand the gravity of what's happened. Mauricio tried to salvage some ground. I didn't know. If you had identified yourself, identified himself. Dr. Henry cut him off sharply. A man like Sebastio shouldn't have to identify himself just to be treated with basic respect. What kind of establishment are you running here? The question sliced through the air. Guests glared at Mauricio with open disapproval. A wealthy couple exchanged meaningful looks, clearly questioning the hotel's standards. Just then, Carla, the receptionist, approached nervously. Mr. Mauricio, she whispered. There's a gentleman here insisting he must speak urgently with Mr. Sebastio. Mauricio turned to see a man in his 40s, dark suit, leather briefcase, and the confident stride of someone used to high-stakes deals. Mr. Sebastio, the man said directly, I'm Marcos Oliveira from Oliveira and Associates Auctions. I need to speak with you about tomorrow's lots. Sebastio greeted him warmly. Marcos, how are you? Any problem with the event? Not exactly a problem, Marcos replied, opening his briefcase. We've received some advance offers for elite sires we know you're interested in. We'd like to give you preference before opening them to others. The lobby collectively held its breath. Advance offers. Preference. What kind of figures are we talking about? Sebastio asked. Well above market average, Marcos said. Several lots already have offers in the millions. Mauricio collapsed into a chair, unable to stand. Millions. And the man he'd treated like a beggar was discussing them as if they were pocket change. I'll think about it, Sebastio replied. I need to evaluate the animals in person first. Of course, Marcos agreed. You're staying here, right? I'll pick you up in the morning to head to the Javits Center. Actually, Sebastio glanced at Mauricio with a gentle smile. I'm still resolving some details about my stay. Marcos followed his gaze and immediately sensed the tension. Is there a problem, Mr. Sebastio? Dr. Henry stepped forward. The manager here made a bet with Sebastio. If he paid $800 in cash for the cheapest room, he'd get the presidential suite free. Marcos turned to Mauricio in disbelief, then burst into laughter. A bet? With Sebastio Mendonça? You do realize he's one of our biggest clients. The words hit Mauricio like a punch to the gut. One of the auction's largest investors. In fact, Marcos added, at the last Sao Paulo auction, his acquisitions moved staggering sums. The silence in the lobby was total now. Even the cleaning staff had stopped working. Mauricio's catastrophic error was clearer with every revelation. But Sebastio remained calm. Marcos, Henry, thank you for your support, but let's resolve this peacefully. The young man made a bet. I paid the $800. Now he'll honor his word. Mauricio's eyes darted to the cash still spread across the counter. $800, less than what Sebastio probably spent on a single business dinner. He had wagered against a man who handled fortunes like loose change. The suite, Mauricio whispered, barely audible. What? Sebastio asked politely. The presidential suite, Mauricio repeated louder, is at your disposal. But Sebastio wasn't done. The biggest revelation was yet to come. He calmly retrieved an old, well-kept leather folder from his bag. The silence was absolute. Every eye was locked on him as if watching the climax of a film. Before I accept the suite, Sebastio said, returning to the counter, I should clarify something. Mauricio stared, wide-eyed, like an animal trapped in a corner. His hands shook violently. You were right about one thing, Sebastio continued, opening the folder. I should have identified myself sooner. Dr. Henry and Marcos exchanged curious looks. What could possibly top everything already revealed? Sebastio pulled out an official document, its seals gleaming under the chandelier light, and handed it to Mauricio. Read it aloud, for everyone, he suggested kindly. Mauricio's face drained further as he held the paper, trembling so badly it shook like a leaf in the wind. I can't, he stuttered. Dr. Henry stepped in, taking the document from his hands. Let me see this. He adjusted his glasses, scanned it once, twice, then his eyes widened in shock. My God, Sebastio, you never told me this. What is it? Marcos pressed. Dr. Henry cleared his throat, his voice booming across the silent lobby. Certificate of Property Ownership, registered at the New York County Clerk's office. The reception leaned forward collectively like an audience awaiting the grand finale of a performance. Owner Sebastian Mendonça da Silva, continued Dr. Henry, his voice growing louder with admiration. Owner of the Grand Palace Building, Hotel, and adjacent property located at 2847 Fifth Avenue, New York. The impact was like an explosion in the lobby. Several people gasped in shock. An executive dropped her phone. A businessman choked on the coffee he was drinking. Maurice literally staggered backward, needing to lean against the wall to keep from falling. He's the owner of the hotel? Exclaimed a woman, her voice shrill with disbelief. Mark stood speechless, staring between the document and Sebastian. Sebastian, when did you buy the Grand Palace? 3 years ago, Sebastian replied calmly, as if discussing the weather. The previous group was struggling financially. It was an interesting investment. Maurice felt as though the world had spun upside down. For 20 minutes, he had humiliated, mocked, and disrespected the very man who owned the hotel where he worked. The man who indirectly signed his paychecks. The man who could fire him with a nod. 3 years, Maurice muttered to himself. Exactly, confirmed Sebastian. Since then, I've received monthly reports on the hotel's performance. Guest satisfaction, service quality, staff efficiency. Each word pierced Maurice's heart. The owner had been watching everything, and Maurice had just delivered the worst customer service episode in the hotel's history. Dr. Henry shook his head in disbelief. Sebastian, why didn't you ever tell me you bought the Grand Palace? I prefer to keep my urban investments separate from my agricultural businesses, Sebastian explained. Besides, I like to see how things really work when no one knows who I am. It's the only way to judge the true quality of service. The phrase struck Maurice like lightning. Sebastian had deliberately tested the hotel, and Maurice had failed spectacularly. Mark still stared at the document with fascination. How much did the acquisition cost, if you don't mind me asking? It was a considerable investment, Sebastian answered diplomatically. Considerable from a man who spoke of millions as if they were pennies meant an astronomical fortune. Maurice had to sit in a nearby chair before his legs gave way completely. And the most interesting part, Sebastian continued as he tucked the document into his briefcase, is that every month I receive reports praising the excellent quality of service provided by our general manager. Maurice felt his blood run cold. The reports were the very ones he had written, filled with fabricated stories about satisfied guests and exceptional service. Very creative reports, added Sebastian with a smile that never reached his eyes. The entire reception now watched Maurice as if he were a rare specimen in a zoo. The humiliation was complete, total, devastating. He had been caught not only mistreating a guest but also mistreating his own employer while lying systematically about his professional performance. Mr. Sebastian, Maurice whispered desperately. I didn't know. Please. Sebastian studied him for a long moment, his calm eyes weighing the man who had tried to humiliate him publicly. The reception waited in tense silence. Justice had arrived, and now came the final judgment. The silence was deafening, everyone holding their breath. Maurice trembled, visibly broken, awaiting the verdict that would define his future. Sebastian walked slowly around the counter, his steps echoing on the marble floor like the ticking of a clock. marking the final seconds of Morris's career. When he finally stopped in front of the manager, his eyes were calm but carried the weight of a decision already. Attention, are the monthly reports you submitted filled with false information about your own performance while treating guests like this? Maurice closed his eyes, knowing his career was finished. When he opened them again, he met Sebastian's steady gaze. "Please, Mr. Sebastian," he finally murmured, voice breaking. I have a family. I need this job." Sebastian nodded slowly. "I know you have a family, Maurice, and that's exactly why I'll give you an opportunity." A murmur of surprise spread through the lobby. Maurice lifted his eyes, a spark of hope flickering through his despair. "An opportunity?" he repeated, hardly believing it. "You will be transferred," Sebastian said calmly, "to our farm upstate. You'll begin as an administrative assistant with a salary adjusted to the new role. There you'll learn humility, honest work, and how to treat people with respect." The offer was both punishment and chance for redemption. Maurice would be drastically demoted, but he would keep his job and the possibility of rebuilding his life. "If in a year you truly demonstrate change," Sebastian added, "we'll discuss your return to the hospitality business, but in a role where you learn to serve, not to humiliate." Maurice nodded vigorously, tears of relief and shame streaming down his face. "Yes, sir, yes, I accept. Thank you for the second chance." Sebastian turned to the receptionist, Carla, who had watched wide-eyed. "Carla, you will temporarily take over as manager," he announced. "I saw how you tried to remain polite even in a difficult situation. That shows character." Carla was speechless, barely able to believe the unexpected promotion. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." "I'm sure you will," Sebastian smiled. "And the first decision I want you to make is clear policy. In this hotel, every guest will be treated with equal respect, regardless of appearance." "Yes, sir. It will be a pleasure to implement that policy." Dr. Henry stepped closer, clearly impressed with how Sebastian had handled the situation. "Sebastian, you never cease to surprise me. Many men in your position would have simply fired him." "Firing him would have been the easy way out," Sebastian replied. "But it teaches nothing. Maurice will learn through experience that true success comes from character, not arrogance." Mark shook his head in admiration. "That's why you're so respected in business, Sebastian. You see beyond the obvious." Sebastian retrieved his $800 from the counter and handed it to Carla. "Use this for customer service training for the entire staff. I want this to be the last incident of its kind." "It will be done, sir." Maurice approached timidly. "Mr. Sebastian, when should I report upstate?" "Monday," Sebastian answered. "My caretaker, Mr. John, will teach you what honest work means. He's 70 years old and has more wisdom than many executives I've met." For the first time, Maurice nodded with genuine humility. "Thank you for the second chance, sir. I promise you won't regret it." Sebastio placed a hand on the former manager's shoulder. "Mauricio, everyone deserves a chance at redemption. What you do with that chance depends entirely on you." Dr. Enrique smiled and turned to the guests who had been watching. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed how a true leader resolves conflicts with both justice and mercy." The lobby erupted in spontaneous applause. Guests, staff, even people who had paused on the sidewalk to watch through the glass doors, all clapped for that extraordinary display of wisdom and humanity. Sebastio put his hat back on and picked up his leather briefcase. "Well," he said to Dr. Enrique and Marcos, "how about we head upstairs? We have an auction to plan for tomorrow, and I still need to review some details of the lots." As the three made their way to the elevator, the entire lobby continued to watch them with admiration. Sebastio had turned what could have been a simple act of revenge into a life lesson for everyone present. True justice hadn't just been done. It had been delivered with wisdom, compassion, and the greatness of someone who understands that true power lies in lifting others, not humiliating them. And so, the simple farmer from the countryside taught everyone that real wealth isn't measured by the money in the bank, but by the size of one's heart and the way we treat our fellow humans. After all, character can't be bought with money. It's built with dignity. True wealth is how you treat those who don't owe you anything. Have you ever underestimated someone or judged them by their cover? Share in the comments what you've learned from this. If Sebastio's turnaround inspired you to rethink your actions, leave a like now and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. See you in the next video.